You saw the sign from the parking lot, that tall backlit pylon rising over a sea of cars, glowing against the evening sky. Inside, the glass doors slid open on their own, and the cold air hit you first. Then the sound. A fountain somewhere down the concourse, coins winking at the bottom of it. The shine of the floor, waxed so bright you could almost see yourself in it. And the smell, cinnamon and hot pretzels, buttered popcorn, the sweet froth of an orange Julius. All of it mixed together into one thing that meant only one thing. You were at the mall, and it was Saturday. For a whole generation of Americans, this was the center of the world. Not a store, a place. The place you went when you had nowhere you had to be. Where you could spend 8 hours and maybe $2 and come home feeling like you'd lived a whole day. Stay with me, because a few of these are going to stop you cold. Number 3 was the loudest, most alive corner of the entire building on a Saturday afternoon. The one spot where the whole town seemed to show up at once. And number one was dark. It pulsed with light and sound, and it was the one place in that whole mall your parents could never quite find you. All of it is gone now. Not all the buildings. Some still stand, half empty, their fountains dry, their food courts echoing. But the world we're about to walk back into has quietly disappeared. Nobody killed it. No villain locked the doors. The truth is gentler and sadder than that. The world moved inside the little screens we carry in our pockets. You didn't need to leave home to find your friends, or buy your music, or just be somewhere anymore. Convenience did what no wrecking ball ever could. So before we start, if you remember any of this, if you were one of the kids who lived at the mall, subscribe and walk with us. We're going to remember it together. 25 things that made the 1980s mall the center of everything. Let's begin. Right there in the middle of the concourse, mounted on a chest-high pedestal, stood the map, a big backlit board under scratched plexiglass, the whole mall laid out like a little city seen from above. And somewhere on it, a bright red star, and 4 words that anchored you in the world. You are here. You'd walk up and lean in, tracing a finger along the concourse. Sears was the big block at one end, J.C. Penney at the other, and buried between them, in a color-coded list of 100 names, was the store you were actually looking for. Half the time the arrow pointed the opposite way from how you were standing, and you'd have to turn yourself around like a compass to make sense of it. Nobody thinks about it now, but that little board was the closest thing that mall had to a heartbeat. It's where you told your friends to meet. By the map. Everybody knew where the map was. It didn't need an address. Then the maps moved. Into our phones. Into the blue dot that always knows where you're standing, that never points the wrong way, that never makes you turn in a circle. We gained something? Sure, we always do. But we lost the little ritual of standing shoulder to shoulder with a stranger, both of you squinting at the same board, both of you a little lost in the same place. You are here, it said. And for a few hours on a Saturday, that was enough. By the doors of every store, in a little herd, stood the machines. A row of glass globes on chrome stands, each one filled with something a kid wanted more than air. Gumballs the size of golf balls in colors that don't exist in nature. Super balls that promise to bounce over the roof. Stickers, temporary tattoos, and those clear plastic bubbles with a mystery prize rattling around inside. A tiny troll, a sticky hand, a ring that would turn your finger green by Tuesday. The whole thing cost $0.25. You'd tug on your mother's sleeve and put on the face, and if it was a good day, she'd dig one out of her purse. You'd feed it in, close both hands around that stiff chrome crank, and turn with your whole body. Then the clunk, the prize dropping into the little metal door. The gasp of not knowing what you got until you saw it. Old-timers remember when a machine like that stood outside nearly every shop, and the quarters in your pocket felt like real money, because they could buy you a small piece of joy. Then the quarters went away. We stopped carrying change. Everything became a tap and a screen, and there was nothing left to feed the machines, so one by one they were wheeled off and never replaced. A whole economy of childhood, run on a single coin, just quietly closed up shop. We didn't notice it go. That's the saddest part. Nobody ever does. It was never a big store, but somehow it held everything. Radio Shack, tucked between the shoe store and the card shop, wall to wall with little drawers and blister packs and things most people couldn't name. Coils of wire, packets of tiny fuses, adapters for adapters. The air had that faint smell of warm plastic and fresh batteries. By some accounts, the thing that pulled the kids in was the floor. A remote control car, out of its box, buzzing in tight circles across the tile, while a boy hunched over the controller like his life depended on it. There was always a demo. There was always a crowd of 9-year-olds around it. Old-timers remember the little card, too. The one that got you a free battery every month if you just kept coming back. And the clerk who asked for your name and address at the register, even if you were only buying a $2 plug, and wrote it all down by hand. It was the place your father went for the part that would fix the thing in the garage, and the place you went to dream about the future. The walkie-talkies, the tiny radios, the first home computers glowing on the back shelf like something out of a movie. Then the future arrived, and it didn't need a little store in the mall. The big boxes came, and then the screens, and any gadget you wanted could be at your door by morning. The drawers full of small, useful things had nowhere left to be. Somewhere a boy is still hunched over that controller, chasing a car around the tile. But the store around him is gone. Every mall had one, and it was the quietest store in the building. The card and gift shop, a little pool of calm off the loud concourse, where the light was warm and the air smelled of potpourri and scented candles, and something faintly floral you could never name. Walls of greeting cards in slotted racks, sorted by occasion, from floor to eye level. Birthday, anniversary, get well, sympathy, and a whole wall for the ones that just said thinking of you. By some accounts, there was a card in that store for every single thing a human heart could feel. Somebody, somewhere, had sat down and written a little verse for the death of a pet, for a friend moving away, for a grandmother turning 80. And there it was, waiting in a rack, for the day you needed it. You'd stand there with a friend, both of you pulling the funny ones out, reading them sideways, snorting, sliding them back in the wrong slots. Then you'd get serious, because Grandma's birthday was Sunday, and you'd stand there reading 20 of them until you found the one that said it right. Up front were the little keepsakes, the music boxes, the porcelain figurines, the ornament you bought once a year and kept forever. Then the words moved into the phone. A birthday became a text. Sympathy became a comment. Why drive to a store and pick out a card and find a stamp when your thumb could do it in 3 seconds? The little shop with the potpourri smell had nothing left to sell but the one thing nobody had time for anymore: the trouble of caring on paper. A card meant someone had stood in a store and thought of you. That was the whole gift. We just stopped sending it. Tucked between the department stores, under soft light, was the bookstore. A Walden Books, or a B. Dalton, small but somehow endless. The smell hit you first, that clean, dry smell of new paper and glossy magazine covers, and then the hush, the way voices dropped the moment you crossed the threshold. Wooden shelves running back into the store, a bargain table by the door with a hand-lettered sign. Old-timers remember that these little shops sat in nearly every mall in America, 2 or 3 storefronts from the fountain. And they remember the magazine rack most of all. A whole wall of it, every subject under the sun, hot rods and homemaking and Hollywood, spines lined up like a rainbow. You'd go in with no plan and no money and stay for an hour. You'd sit right down on the carpet in the back corner with a stack of magazines you had no intention of buying, and nobody rushed you. You'd pick up the new paperback everybody was talking about, read the first page, and put it back. That was the whole outing, just browsing. Then the big warehouse stores came and undercut them, and after that came the screen that held every book ever written and never made you leave the couch. The little mall bookshops couldn't survive on people who came to sit on the floor and read for free. One by one the lights went out. You can search for anything now, but you can't stumble on it, and stumbling was the best part. Near the front doors, bolted to the wall in a little row, were the payphones. Cool metal, a heavy silver cord you could stretch and coil around your finger, and a fat book of the whole city's phone numbers hanging beneath on a chain, its pages soft as cloth from 1,000 hands. It took a coin, a dime once, a quarter later, and old-timers remember the trick every kid knew by heart. You'd call home collect, and when the operator asked your name, you'd say something fast like, "Come get me, Mom," before anybody could accept the charges. The call never went through. Nobody paid a cent, and your mother, hearing it, knew to get in the car. That was the end of every long Saturday. You'd dig for a coin, or you'd run the collect call trick, and then you'd sit on the bench by the doors and wait, watching for the headlights of the family car pulling up to the curb. Then the phone came home with us, into every pocket, every hand, always there, never needing a coin. And the silver phones by the doors went silent, then got unbolted from the walls, and the little shelves where the phone books hung stood empty. There used to be a moment when you had to reach out on purpose, drop a coin, say the words, and wait. And someone always came. Behind a curtain in the corner sat the photo booth. A little stall barely big enough for one, with a hard bench, a coin slot, and a promise. 4 pictures, a couple of minutes, and a strip of them still warm and damp when it slid out the side. The photo booth was older than the mall itself. By some accounts, these machines had been making strips of black and white pictures since your grandparents were young, in dime stores and boardwalks long before there was a food court. But there it was, tucked past the card shop, waiting. You'd cram in 2 friends, 3 if you were small, or you and a sweetheart pressed cheek to cheek. The little screen counted down, and you had just enough time to make a serious face, then a silly one, then a real one where somebody laughed at the wrong moment. Then the wait by the slot, watching for the strip, and the argument over who got to keep it. Usually you'd tear it down the middle and share. Then the cameras went digital, and then they went into the phone, and suddenly a picture cost nothing, and you could take 1,000 of them and throw them all away. Nobody needed a booth, or a curtain, or 2 quiet minutes squeezed together in the dark. We take 1,000 pictures now and keep none of them. You used to get 4, and you kept them for the rest of your life. You could tell that store apart from 30 feet down the concourse, because it was the dark one. While every other shop blazed with bright white light, this one glowed, black light in the back turning white shirts electric blue, a lava lamp bubbling slow in the window, and posters, walls of them, rolled up in bins and hung overhead, band posters and trick posters, and the kind with a puppy that made you say, "Aww." The novelty shop, Spencer's, or one of its cousins, in nearly every mall in the country. By some accounts, a store like that had been mailing gag gifts to Americans since the years right after the war, long before it ever took a spot by the food court. But by the 80s, it had found its home in the mall, right where the teenagers were. You went in on a dare, mostly. 2 or 3 of you, giggling, past the whoopee cushions and the joy buzzers and the mugs with the jokes on them, back toward the black light where the older kids stood. You'd try on the goofy sunglasses. You'd pick up the fake $1 million bill. You'd spend $1 on a gag your brother would hate and feel like you'd gotten away with something. Then the gags moved online, where every joke in the world was a click away and nobody had to walk past anything. The dark little store with the glowing posters had nothing left that couldn't be bought cheaper from a couch. It was the one store that felt a little dangerous when you were 12. That was the whole thrill of it. But to understand why any of this mattered, why a building full of stores could feel like the center of a young person's whole world, you have to understand what the mall was back then. In the 1980s, the suburban mall was the beating social heart of American youth. It was public and it was free. It was warm in January and cool in July, when your house had 1 window unit and the pool was 30 minutes away. It was safe enough that a mother could drop her kids at the door on a Saturday morning and pick them up at 5. There was nowhere else like it. A whole indoor town where a teenager could just be, all day, among their own. No wonder we loved it. For a lot of us, it was the first place we were ever free. Down near the fountain, the sweet smell reached you before the sign did. The ice cream shop, a glass case fogged with cold, and behind it, tubs and tubs of it in every color, the scoops standing up in soft peaks. A kid in a paper hat, a metal scoop resting in a little well of cloudy water, and a stack of cones waiting by the register. Old-timers remember when it was all hand-dipped, no soft serve machine, just a strong wrist and a scoop that the clerk had to lean into. 31 flavors at some, more at others, and a little pink spoon held out over the counter, so you could taste one before you chose. You'd press your face to the glass and take forever, because it mattered. Chocolate chip or bubble gum, sugar cone or the flat cake one. Then you'd carry it out into the concourse, already dripping, already racing the heat of your own hand, and you'd eat it walking, past the fountain, in no hurry at all. Then the chains changed, and the malls thinned out, and the little counter where a person leaned into the scoop for you gave way to a freezer case and a machine. The paper hat and the strong wrist weren't needed anymore. A machine can serve ice cream. It just can't hand it to you like it was glad you came in. A few doors down was the loudest, brightest store a kid could imagine, and it went all the way up. KB Toys, packed floor to ceiling, aisles so narrow 2 carts couldn't pass, and boxes stacked so high the top ones needed a pole to reach. Every color in the world was in there, and all of it was calling your name. By some accounts, it started as a candy company generations back, before it ever sold a single toy. But the kids who grew up in the 80s never knew that or cared. All they knew was the wall of action figures, the bins of little cars, the board games stacked to the sky, and the smell of new plastic that meant Christmas was coming. You didn't go in to buy, you went in to look and to want. You'd stand in front of the thing you wanted most and just hold the box, reading every word on the back, memorizing it for the list you'd give your mother. Sometimes she said yes. Mostly she said maybe. And maybe was enough to bring you back next Saturday. Then the big box stores came with lower prices, and after them came the screen where every toy on Earth showed up with 2-day shipping. The little store packed to the ceiling couldn't stack them high enough to compete. Wanting something for weeks used to be half the joy. Now it comes tomorrow, and the wanting never gets to grow. You heard it before you reached it. The music, thumping out past the doorway into the concourse, louder than anywhere else in the mall. The clothing store, dim inside, lit like a nightclub, the newest song playing loud enough to feel, and a wall of cologne and perfume so thick you could taste it from the doorway. This was where the look lived. The acid-washed denim, the neon, the shoulder pads, whatever the older kids were wearing that season, folded in tall, glossy stacks under posters of models who seemed impossibly grown. The clerks were teenagers too, a few years older, unbearably cool, and they barely looked up when you came in. You'd flip through the racks with your friends, holding things up, checking the mirror, doing the math in your head against the babysitting money in your pocket. You didn't always buy, but you left smelling like the store, and for an hour, you felt like you belonged to something new. Then the trends moved faster than any store could stock them, and the clothes moved online, and the loud, dark shop that smelled like teenage summer had no reason to keep the music on. You could buy the clothes anywhere now. But you can't buy the feeling of walking out of that store at 15, sure the whole world was about to open up. It had its own name out front in bold letters, and every kid in town knew it. Sam Goody, Musicland, the big music chain that anchored a whole wing of the mall. Rows of long cardboard sleeves in the bins, cassette tapes racked behind glass, and up on the wall, the chart, the countdown of what everybody in America was listening to that week. That was where you went the day the new album dropped. By some accounts, chains like these grew out of little record counters that had been selling music since the days of the big bands, back when a record was a heavy black disc that could shatter if you dropped it. But by the 80s, they were their own kingdom, a whole store devoted to nothing but sound. You'd saved for it. Weeks of allowance, or a birthday $5 bill folded in your pocket, and you walked straight past everything else to the bin where your album lived. You'd carry it to the register like it was made of glass. And then the wait, the long ride home, the tearing of the shrink wrap, the needle dropping or the tape clicking in, and the whole thing washing over you for the very first time. Then the music left the store. It came down through the air, into the phone, and now every song ever recorded costs less than one album used to, and lives nowhere you can hold. The store with the wall-size chart had nothing left to sell that couldn't be summoned from a pocket. You used to have to want a song, and save for it, and carry it home. Now it's all free, and somehow it means less. A few doors down was the other kind of music store, smaller, darker, and covered wall-to-wall in posters. This was where you went not to buy the hit, but to disappear for an hour. Bins of records you flipped through with both hands, that soft, rhythmic clack of album covers falling forward one after another, and overhead, a whole sky of posters, the bands, the album art, the faces that hung on a million bedroom walls. Old-timers remember the album cover as a thing you studied. 12 inches square, big enough to be art, with liner notes small enough that you'd take the record over to the light to read every name. There were people who came in just to look at the covers, and nobody minded. You'd stand at the bin next to strangers, everybody flipping, nobody talking, all of you chasing the same feeling. The record you didn't know you were looking for until it was in your hands. The clerk behind the counter knew everything, and if you asked the right way, he'd tell you what to listen to next. Then the covers shrank to a thumbnail on a screen, and the flipping stopped, and the wall of posters had no wall to hang on. A song became a file, and the art around it just fell away. We didn't just lose the music store. We lost the 12 inches of art that used to come wrapped around every song. You smelled it from halfway down the concourse. That warm, yeasty, buttery smell that reached out and took you by the collar. The pretzel cart. A little glass case parked right in the middle of the walkway. The pretzels hanging on their pegs or piled under the light. Soft and golden and dusted with big crystals of salt. By some accounts, the soft pretzel was older than the country itself, brought over by families who'd been twisting the same shape by hand for hundreds of years, a knot that some say was meant to look like arms folded in prayer. But there in the mall, none of that mattered. What mattered was that it was hot, and it was $1, and it was right there. You'd get one on the way in and one on the way out. You'd tear it apart with your fingers, the inside soft and steaming, the outside chewy and salted, and if you were feeling rich, you got the little tub of yellow mustard to go with it. You ate it walking. You always ate it walking. Then the carts thinned out with the crowds, and when the foot traffic died, the little stand in the middle of the concourse had nobody left to walk past it. The smell that used to fill the whole hallway just faded out. It cost $1, and it made the whole mall smell like home. You can't buy that anymore at any price. Here's the part nobody saw coming. Because for all that life, all that noise and smell and crowd, it didn't last. Somewhere in the late years, the tide began to go out. The catalogs became websites, and the websites became a store in your pocket that never closed and never made you find a parking spot. Why drive across town when the box showed up at your door? Why meet at the mall when everyone was already on the little screen? Nobody decided to leave. They just, one by one, stopped coming. And the malls began to empty. The stores going dark, the fountains shut off, the food courts falling quiet. We even made a name for the ones that died all the way. Dead malls. Vast silent buildings where the lights still hum over floors that no feet cross. You can walk them today and hear your own echo where 1,000 Saturdays used to roar. Down by the food court, at the counter that always had a line, was the drink you couldn't get anywhere else. Orange Julius. That frothy, creamy, orange cream cloud in a tall cup, cold enough to fog the plastic, sweet and tangy, and topped with a head of foam like nothing you'd had before. By some accounts, it was born at a little juice stand out west, generations back, when a man tinkered with plain orange juice until he'd made something smoother and frothier that customers started asking for by name. By the 80s, that name hung over a counter in nearly every mall in America, the blenders roaring behind it. You'd order one after the long afternoon and watch them make it, the whir of the machine, the orange froth climbing the sides, the cup filling up cold in the clerk's hand. Then that first sip through the straw, the foam and the cold and the sweet all at once, and the walk back out into the concourse with your friends, cup sweating in your grip. Then the counters closed as the malls emptied, and the frothy orange drink that lived only at the mall had nowhere else to go. It didn't move online. It didn't move anywhere. It mostly just stopped. Some tastes never made it out of the mall. When the mall went quiet, they went with it, and you can still taste it, but only in your memory. At one end of the mall, past the last store, the ceiling opened up and the lights changed. The movie theater. A little box office under a glowing marquee, the title spelled out in black plastic letters somebody changed by hand every week, and that smell rolling out to meet you halfway down the concourse. Hot popcorn and melted butter, thick enough to walk through. By some accounts, the mall was where the movies split apart. The old downtown palace had one big screen and one show. The mall theater had 2, then 4, then 6, all under one roof, so you could pick from a whole board of titles at the same window. It felt like the future. Your parents would drop you at the door with a 5 and enough for popcorn, and you'd hand over your ticket to be torn in half and step into the dark. The floor a little sticky under your sneakers, the seats that folded up when you stood, the popcorn in the red striped tub, drowned in that yellow butter you asked for extra, salt on your fingers for the rest of the night. And when the lights went down, the whole room went quiet together. Then the screen came home. First the big box in the living room, then the wall-sized one, then the little one in your hand, and any movie you wanted played whenever you pressed the button. The mall theater, with its sticky floor and its handset letters, couldn't compete with the couch. We can watch anything now, anytime, alone. We just don't sit in the dark with strangers and jump at the same moment anymore. Back toward the electronics store, there was always a crowd, and it was always kids. Because there, on a stand near the front, hooked up to the biggest television in the place, sat a video game console with a controller just dangling there, free to play, a demo running on a loop, the music tinny through the store speakers, and a knot of boys taking turns without anyone in charge. Old-timers remember, this was how you played a game before you owned it. Nobody had every system at home, so you came to the store and you waited your turn and you got 3 minutes on the new one before the next kid started breathing down your neck. And that was enough to keep you dreaming about it for a month. You'd stand in a half circle, coaching the kid with the controller, groaning when he died, cheering when he made the jump. Strangers, mostly. But for the length of one level you were a team, and every so often a clerk would come around the corner and tell you all to move along, and you'd scatter and drift back 5 minutes later. Then the games came home for good, and every kid had his own, and there was no reason to stand in a store and wait your turn on a screen you didn't own. The little crowd around the display just melted away. We each have every game now, in our own rooms, alone. We traded the crowd around the screen for a screen of our own. You never noticed it, and that was the whole point. Soft music, drifting down from somewhere in the ceiling, floating over the whole mall at a volume just under hearing. Strings and soft horns, the songs you knew made smooth and slow and easy, playing in every corridor from open to close. Nobody chose it. Nobody turned it up. It was just there, like the air. By some accounts, it was made that way on purpose, engineered to be pleasant and forgettable, to keep the crowd calm and unhurried, to make you feel like you had all the time in the world to stroll and look and stay a little longer. It worked. You never rushed at the mall. Part of that was the music you weren't even hearing. It was the sound of a Saturday. It was under the fountain and under the footsteps and under the chatter, holding the whole day together like a thread you couldn't see. You only ever noticed it in the rare quiet moment, waiting on a bench, alone for a second, when you'd suddenly hear it and feel oddly at peace. Then the crowds thinned and the stores went dark, and in the malls that emptied out, somebody finally turned the music off. And what was left was the thing that music had been hiding all along, the silence. That's how you know a mall has died, not by the empty stores, by the quiet where the music used to be. Right in the center of it all, where the corridors met, was the fountain, a wide tiled pool with water leaping up in the middle. catching the light, the sound of it splashing down the one cool natural sound in that whole climate-controlled world. And under the surface, scattered across the bottom, a shimmer of copper and silver. Coins! Thousands of them! Old-timers remember that nobody could walk past it without reaching into a pocket. You'd fish out a penny, close your eyes for half a second, and toss it in. A wish for something a 10-year-old wishes for. And some malls gathered up all those coins in time and gave them away to folks who needed them, so all those little wishes added up to something after all. It was the landmark, the anchor, the place you said you'd meet. By the fountain. Little kids leaned over the edge until a parent grabbed a collar. Teenagers sat on the wide rim and watched the crowd go by. And everyone, at some point, made a wish they never told anybody. Then the crowds went home, and the fountains cost money to run, and in mall after mall somebody shut off the pump and let the water go still. They drained them. They filled some with dirt and put a potted plant where the wishes used to be. A whole generation dropped its secret wishes into that water. When they turned it off, they poured all of them out. You could walk in one Saturday, and the whole place had changed overnight. The center court, the wide-open heart of the mall where the corridors met, dressed itself for every season of the year, and it did it while you slept. One month it was pastel eggs and paper flowers hanging from the skylight for spring, then red, white, and blue banners for summer. Then a wall of orange and gold and cardboard leaves for fall, with a scarecrow and a pile of pumpkins nobody was allowed to touch. By some accounts, the mall was built to be the town square, and a town square dresses for the calendar. So, somewhere in the back, in a room most people never saw, were crates and crates of it. The garlands, the banners, the giant ornaments. Brought out on a schedule, hung overnight by men on tall ladders after the gates came down. You marked the year by it. You knew fall had really come when the leaves went up over the fountain, and you knew the big one was coming. Christmas, when the tree went up in the center court, 2 stories tall, wrapped in 1,000 lights, and the whole mall seemed to hold its breath. Kids stood under it with their necks craned all the way back. Then the crowds thinned, and when the money got tight, the decorations were the first thing to go. Fewer banners, a smaller tree. And in the malls that emptied all the way, the crates stayed in the back room, and the center court stood bare through every season, keeping time for no one. The mall was a calendar you could walk through. It kept the year for the whole town, and dressed up to do it. So here's the truth of it, now that we've walked this far. The mall didn't die because it was bad. It didn't die because we stopped loving it. It died because life quietly moved somewhere else, inside the little glowing screens we all carry now. We didn't have to drive there to find our friends, or buy our music, or see a movie, or just be somewhere among people. It all came to us, and it was easier, and we took it. Nobody's to blame, and not everything about those days was perfect, but something real went out of the world when the corridors emptied. A way of being young in public, a place to simply exist, together, for free. That doesn't come back. Off in the center court every December, on a raised platform trimmed with fake snow and candy-striped poles, sat the throne, and on it, in red velvet and real black boots, sat Santa Claus. Not a picture of him, not a screen. Him, close enough to touch, with a helper in an elf hat working the line and a camera on a tripod aimed right at his lap. Old-timers remember that the stores had been bringing Santa indoors for generations. Long before the mall, back to the days of the big downtown department stores. But the mall Santa became the Santa for millions of American kids, the one you actually met, the one whose beard you were pretty sure was real. The line wrapped halfway around the court, and you waited in it forever, nervous the whole time, rehearsing your list. Then it was your turn, and your mother nudged you forward, and you climbed up onto that knee, and for one held breath you were face to face with the man himself. You whispered the one thing you wanted most. He nodded like it was the most important thing he'd heard all day. The flash went off, and you climbed down with a candy cane and your heart pounding. Then the crowds thinned, and now you book a time slot on a website, or a child meets Santa through a screen, and the long, magical line that assembled itself in the center court just came apart. You waited an hour to whisper one wish to a stranger in a red suit, and you believed every second of it. That kind of believing is hard to come by now. This is the one that's hardest to explain to anybody young. You didn't call ahead. You didn't text. You just went to the mall on a Saturday, alone, and by the afternoon you were somehow surrounded by everyone you knew. Because everyone you knew was there too. The mall was where the whole town happened to be. Old-timers remember that this was simply how it worked before everyone carried a phone. You couldn't reach people once they'd left the house. So you didn't try. You went to the place where they'd be, and the place where they'd be was the mall, by the fountain, by the food court, drifting the same loop you were. So the afternoon just assembled itself. You'd round a corner by the record store, and there was half your class. You'd sit on the fountain rim, and more would wander up. Nobody organized it. Nobody was in charge of it. A whole day of friendship built itself out of pure chance, and you never once wondered how everyone found each other, because everyone always did. Then the phone came, and it could reach anyone, anywhere, at any moment, and the moment it could, we stopped needing a place to find each other. Why drift the loop hoping to run into your friends when you could just message them from the couch? The corner where half your class used to be standing had nobody standing on it anymore. We used to find each other by simply showing up. Now we can reach anyone, anywhere, and somehow we've never been harder to find. You heard it before you saw it, a wall of sound rolling down the corridor, hundreds of voices and clattering trays, and a dozen registers all going at once. And the smell hit you next? All of it at the same time. Pizza, and egg rolls, and cinnamon buns and fried chicken. A dozen little kitchens breathing out into one big room. This was the food court on a Saturday afternoon. And I told you back at the start that number 3 was the loudest, most alive corner of the whole building. Here it is. By some accounts, the food court was still a fairly new idea back then. Malls hadn't always had one. Somebody figured out that if you ringed a big open room with a dozen little counters and filled the middle with tables, nobody in a family had to agree on where to eat. Dad got his burger, the kids got pizza, Grandma got the Chinese food from the place with the free toothpick samples, and everybody sat down together anyway. So you'd split up at the counters and meet back at a table you'd fought to claim, trays loaded, straws already unwrapped. And you'd look up from your food and see the whole town, the family 3 tables over from church, the kids from school 2 tables down, the old men who came every Saturday for coffee and stayed the whole morning. It was loud, and it was crowded, and it was wonderful. You weren't just eating lunch. You were sitting in the middle of everybody at once. Then the crowds thinned, and the counters went dark one by one, and the great roaring room slowly fell quiet. In the malls that emptied all the way, you can stand in the middle of that food court today and hear a single tray slide across a single table, and the echo of it goes on and on and on. It was the loudest room in town once. Now it's the quietest, and the silence sits right where all that life used to be. You'd walk in with a few dollars folded in your pocket, and you'd walk out at closing time with most of them still there, and yet the day had been full to the brim. This is the other one I promised you at the very start. The Saturday you could spend on 8 hours and maybe $2, and come home feeling like you'd lived a whole life. By some accounts, that was the whole design. The mall was built to be lingered in. It was free to walk into, warm in the dead of winter and cool in the worst of summer, with benches to rest on and a fountain to sit beside, and no clock anywhere on the wall telling you to move along. Nobody made you buy a single thing. You could stay from open to close, and the truth is, they wanted you to. So you did. You walked the whole loop, and then you turned around and walked it again. You window shopped the store you couldn't afford and pressed your nose to the glass. You tried on the sunglasses you weren't buying. You sat on the rim of the fountain and just watched the crowd go by. You split one hot pretzel 4 ways with your friends. The whole day cost you almost nothing, and it gave you everything. A place to be, among people, with nowhere you had to be and no reason at all to leave. Then came the little screen that put a store and a theater and every friend you had right there in your pocket. And all at once there was no reason to go anywhere to be somewhere. Why spend a free Saturday walking a loop when the whole world would come to the couch? The doors still slide open at some of these malls. Hardly anybody walks through them anymore. It was the last free place, somewhere you could go, all day long, and simply be, and it never once cost you a thing. We didn't know what we had until the doors stopped mattering. And now the one I promised you at the very start. Down at the far end of the mall, past the bright stores, there was a doorway that was darker than everywhere else, and you could hear it before you could see it. The lights dropped and the room came alive. Rows of tall cabinets glowing in the dark, their screens flashing red and blue and green across the faces of the kids hunched over them. Cigarette smoke maybe, and the smell of hot electronics, and the constant metal rattle of quarters going in. By some accounts, this was the golden age of the thing. For a few short years, the arcade was the loudest, brightest, most exciting room a young person in America could walk into. And oh, how you wanted to be in it. You'd change your dollars into a fistful of quarters at the machine by the door, and they felt like gold. You'd find your game and drop one in, and for a few minutes nothing else in the world existed. Not school, not home, just you and the screen and the last life you had left. A crowd would gather behind the kid who was good, watching over his shoulder. And if you did something incredible, you got to punch in 3 letters at the top of the screen, and your initials sat there glowing for everyone who came after. Proof, for one afternoon, that you were the best. It was dark in there, and that was the secret of it, because it was the one place in that whole mall your parents could never quite find you. For a few hours, in the glow and the noise, you were entirely on your own, entirely free, entirely yourself. Then the games came home. First the console under the television, then the computer, then the glowing screen in every pocket. Every game ever made. Right there, anytime, for anyone. There was no reason left to change $1 into quarters and stand in the dark among strangers. The cabinets went cold, the rooms went dark for good, and the loudest, most alive corner of the American mall fell silent. But if you close your eyes, you can still hear it. The beeps and the blasts, the rattle of the quarters, the hum you felt in your chest. A whole generation grew up in that glow, and for a few bright years, in the dark at the end of the mall, we were exactly where we wanted to be. That was the 1980s mall, and it's gone now. So let me ask you, of everything we walked through today, which one took you straight back? Was it the pretzel cart, or the fountain, or the arcade in the dark? Tell me the name of your mall down in the comments. The one you grew up in, the one you can still walk in your mind. And tell me the one thing you'd give anything to do there one more time. I read them all, and I promise you, someone else remembers it too. And before you go, if you loved walking these aisles with us, we did it once before, with the great old stores America let slip away. It's called 25 Forgotten Department Stores from the 1960s that America left behind, and it's waiting for you right there on the screen. Come take one more walk with us. We'll leave the lights on,